Today, we're going to try and understand something that feels, well, more complicated than ever. We're going to look at the psychology of modern generations. But we're going to go beyond the memes, beyond the stereotypes, and really dig into the hidden forces that shape who we are.
I mean, you've heard it, right? It's a question that seems to echo through all of human history. We see these little battles play out every single day online, over everything from skinny jeans to work ethic. But what if all of these arguments are missing the point? The real point.
So let's really lean into this idea for a minute. What if the things we see as generational flaws aren't flaws at all? What if they're actually deeply ingrained psychological responses to the completely different worlds we were all born into? What if this whole story is really about adaptation?
To get to the bottom of this, we need to take a little journey back in time. We're going to trace the major historical events, the economic earthquakes, and the technological revolutions that have literally sculpted the modern mind.
Our story is going to start with the last of the analog kids, late Gen X. Then we'll move through that fascinating little microgeneration, the Xennials. From there, we'll re-examine the Millennials, and finally, we'll dive into the world of the first truly digital natives, Gen Z.
So, to really understand where we are now, you have to understand the world that came just before, the world of late Generation X. These were the last kids to grow up in a world that was still overwhelmingly analog. A lot of them were what we'd call latchkey kids, coming home to an empty house after school. And this wasn't some tragedy, it was actually a training ground. It built this deep sense of pragmatism, a really powerful self-reliance. They watched big institutions fail and big promises fall flat, which gave them this healthy dose of skepticism. They have a built-in BS detector because they've seen the bubbles burst before.
Just think about this for a second. If you wanted to meet your friends at the mall, you picked a time, you picked a place, and that was it. You just had to trust that everyone would show up. There were no running 5 minutes late texts, no location sharing. It was a world that demanded a kind of commitment that honestly feels a little bit alien today.
So what about the people born just a few years later? The ones who don't really feel like a cynical Gen Xer, but they don't totally relate to the classic millennial experience either? Well, they are the bridge generation.
They're called Xennials. You might have heard them called the Oregon Trail generation. The key thing here is that they had an analog childhood, but a digital young adulthood. And this dual experience makes them completely unique. They are, in a sense, bilingual, fluent in both the old world of landlines and mixtapes and the new world of instant messages and playlists. So here's a quick little test for you. Did you ever spend hours making a mixtape on a cassette, but then, years later, spend hours crafting the perfect Spotify playlist? Was your first ever social network AOL Instant Messenger or MySpace? If you're nodding your head right now, well, you're probably a Xennial, one of those crucial translators between two completely different eras.
All right, now let's talk about the generation that has probably been stereotyped more than any other. To really understand millennials, we have to look past the avocado toast jokes and look at the economic whiplash they grew up in, a time of incredible optimism that was followed by a truly devastating collapse. The job hopper label is a perfect example of this. The myth says it's about disloyalty or entitlement. But what's the reality? Well, many of them graduated right into the 2008 financial crisis, the worst downturn since the Great Depression. With wages stuck in place and jobs disappearing, changing jobs wasn't just a choice. For many, it was the only way to actually get a meaningful raise. It was a survival strategy. And what about all that talk of them killing industries? The story goes that they just chose experiences over things, but the truth is a little more complicated. When things like houses became completely unaffordable and you're saddled with historic student debt, traditional assets were just off the table. So they shifted their focus. Memories became an asset nobody could take away from them. That wasn't being frivolous, it was being pragmatic. And that brings us to the first true digital natives, Generation Z. This is the first generation that has absolutely no memory of a world before the internet was always on and always in our pockets. And that constant connection has created a totally different psychological landscape.
You see, Gen Z grew up watching the perfectly polished, curated highlight reels on Instagram, and as a result, they developed a powerful allergy to anything that feels fake. Their driving force is a search for what's real, for authenticity. That's why they gravitate towards the chaotic, unpolished energy of TikTok over the picture-perfect world of the old internet. They value transparency, and they are deeply skeptical of traditional institutions.
And this leads to something really fascinating. For Gen Z, who grew up using avatars and usernames, being anonymous online isn't really about hiding.
In a lot of cases, it's actually a tool for expressing parts of themselves more truly and more freely than they feel they can in the real world. For them, the internet can be a laboratory for discovering who they are.
Okay, it's really important that we pause here. Because it's so easy to hear all of this and just start putting everyone you know into neat little boxes. But that's not the goal. The goal is to move from judgment to curiosity.
And here's the most important point. These generational labels are just tools. They're meant to help us understand broad trends, not to define any single person. They are frameworks, not cages. Our actual lives are way too complex for that.
If there is one single thing to take away from our time together, let it be this. Each generation's mindset, their values, their quirks, they aren't problems that need fixing. They are simply adaptive responses to the very specific world that they inherited.
Understanding that we're all just responding to different circumstances, well, that's the first step. It moves us away from conflict and toward conversation, which brings up one final, pretty powerful question.
What if we use these ideas to understand each other better, but then we set the labels aside and just start listening? Maybe that's where the real progress begins.